All right, this is Jeremy Roth-Cushell, and I'm with Greg McCarran.
Hello.
We're from The Antidote, and we are going to be doing Iraq War Part 2 as we begin to look into the origins of how the Iraq War in 2003 came to be. As we just passed the 18th anniversary of the initiation of that war. And anybody who hasn't heard the first part of that can go to our YouTube channel or our Patreon account and find that recording there, where we read through most of the chapter in the book "The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy" by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, and the chapter all about Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East, which is the title of that chapter. And so we've almost finished that chapter, and so we're going to finish up that chapter today. And then if we have a little bit of time, we're going to go about 2 hours today. If we have a little bit of time at the end, we'll start moving into another text that we are working with to help us understand the origins of the Iraq War, which is titled Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. But if we don't have time to get into that today, we will then do a part 3 to continue getting to the bottom of this. So this is chapter 8, Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East in the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. And we stopped at the section titled Fixing the Intelligence on Iraq. Quote, a key part of the public relations campaign to win support for invading Iraq was the manipulation of intelligence information in order to make Saddam look like an imminent threat. Scooter Libby was an important player in this endeavor, visiting the CIA several times to pressure analysts to find evidence that would make the case for war. He also helped prepare a detailed briefing on the Iraq threat in early 2003 that was pushed on Colin Powell, who was then preparing his infamous presentation to the UN Security Council. According to Bob Woodward, Powell's deputy, Richard Armitage, quote, was appalled at what he considered overreaching and hyperbole. Libby was drawing only the worst conclusions from fragments and silky threads, unquote. Although Powell discarded Libby's most outlandish claims, his UN presentation was still riddled with errors, as Powell now acknowledges. The effort to manipulate intelligence, which was then leaked to an alarmist pro-war press, also involved 2 organizations that were created after 9/11 and reported directly to Undersecretary of Defense Douglas Feith. The Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group was tasked to find links between al-Qaeda and Iraq that the intelligence community supposedly missed. Its 2 key members were David Wormser and Michael Malouf, a Lebanese-American who had close ties with Richard Pearl. The New York Times reporter James Risen writes that, quote, Israeli intelligence played a hidden role in convincing Wolfowitz that he couldn't trust the CIA, unquote. And this dissatisfaction helped cause him to rely on Ahmed Chalabi for intelligence and to create the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group. The Office of Special Plans, OSP, was directed to find evidence that could be used to sell the war against Iraq. It was headed by Abram Shulsky, a neoconservative long associated with Wolfowitz, and its rank included several recruits from pro-Israel think tanks, like Michael Rubin from the American Enterprise Institute and Michael Mokovsky, who had worked for then Prime Minister Shimon Peres after graduating from college. Okay, an aside here, this is interesting because I had missed this before. This in the other book that we're going to get to, the Gary Vogler book, Iraq and the Politics of Oil, he actually goes into the background of Fyfe's involvement in putting Makovsky actually at the head of the Pentagon's oil administration in Iraq post-war, and points to his own colleagues in the U.S. intelligence community basically pointing to what Walt and Mearsheimer are pointing to around Makovsky actually working in the Israeli government. But then they say that because he worked in the Israeli Foreign Service and that 98% of people who work in the Israeli Foreign Service are actually a member of the Israeli intelligence community, that it was very, very likely that Michael Makovsky was an Israeli intelligence agent of some sort. But I had not known that Walt and Mearsheimer had actually given the Israeli governmental working background of Michael Makovsky. And this book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt, was published in 2007 after the article of the same name was published the year before in 2006. And as we dealt with a little bit of the background of this book and the article in part one, that they were not able to publish the original article in any element of the U.S. press, is what it looked like. So they had to go to the U.K. to publish it.
London Review of Books, yes.
All right, thank you, Greg. Oh, Greg, did you want to do some fill in on the background of Michael Maloof a little bit, and what the implications of his involvement in at the epicenter of the manufacture of the Iraq War intelligence means about our current moment?
Yeah, and before that, I'll mention real quick, of course, right away at the very beginning, you mentioned Scooter Libby, of course, and that Scooter Libby, the disgraced former chief of staff of Dick Cheney, of course, and his central role in so a lot of the arm twisting that went on around the in terms of intelligence services, in terms of the manufacturing, the propaganda needed to justify this effort in Iraq, and of course, when comes along, Scooter Libby, who pardons him. It's none other, of course, than the anti-war president, Donald Trump, right? I mean, Donald Trump, meanwhile, is in bed with this faction. We talk all the time about the neocon split and how the, never Trumpers were these neoconservative war hawks who hated Trump because they wanted to end wars or whatever. Meanwhile, this other faction of neoconservatives who are much closer to the interests of, say, like Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel directly, were much more friendly and favorable to Trump. So this is another example of that Trump pardoning one of the kingpins of the Iraq actual serious propaganda operation to start the war in Iraq. And then, of course, Jeremy, you mentioned, or to justify it, you mentioned Michael Maloof, and people who have followed the Antidote for a while now we've talked about Michael Maloof quite a bit over the last few years, and Michael Maloof would relate to this current moment because going from his background where he's directly involved with Douglas Feith and Dave Worcester. What was the name of that other? You mentioned Office of Special Plans. What was the name of the other group that Maloof was heading with Wormser? The
Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group, PCEG.
Okay, thank you. And so you have Maloof in there. That's very interesting because what I believe is that that there were articles. We'd have to go back and find them. I think. If I recall, there's a Newsweek article that came out around the time of the propaganda push for the Iraq War, maybe even after that, where it was coming out of reports trying to link Saddam Hussein to some sort of uncovered terror cells in South America. So there was a lot of stuff being pushed. It's bigger than just the weapons of mass destruction. And so Michael Maloof is an interesting guy because he's got a very interesting trajectory that goes from basically, I think he was involved with this whole what we've called this nest of neoconservatives around Richard Pearl, where one of the Prince of Darkness, as he's known in some circles, he's maybe one of the modern day fathers of the modern day neoconservative movement, and goes from being involved in these circles in the Reagan administration to, in the aftermath of September 11th, being closely affiliated with David Wormser and Douglas Feith, two of the as we're going to find out, two of the other primary architects of the Iraq War. Of course, David Wormser being the brains, so to speak, behind the clean break document, which was presented to Benjamin Netanyahu, of plans for the Middle East geopolitically to strengthen Israel's hand and power in the region. As the event of Netanyahu taking power in Israel in 1996. And so Maloof is directly involved with this. Maloof then goes to WorldNet Daily, which is this Christian Zionist, some might call it conspiracy-oriented, but very, very prominent Christian Zionist pro-Israel propaganda website with a lot of neoconservative leanings, also pushing like the pseudo anti-interventionism, anti-war.
And a key go-to of like Alex Jones actually especially around the turn towards the Obama's second administration. It was like always WorldNet Daily and Jerome Corsi types.
Yep. And then Jerome Corsi, of course, went on to be hired by InfoWars after being I believe he was the Washington bureau chief for WorldNet Daily, where Jerome Corsi had both pushed the Swift boat veteran scandal, which had a negative effect on John Kerry's 2004 campaign and all of the benefit of reelecting George W. Bush, and then years later would push things like the Obama birth certificate and working with people such as Sheriff Joe Arpaio in these efforts to try and uncover the real Barack Obama and all this. So running some key psychological operations at WorldNet Daily, and then he goes to InfoWars. And so this is also where Michael Maloof comes from. And from what I've seen of Michael Maloof, he goes to RT, Russia Today, which of course is a primary Russian media state propaganda outlet, and he's at RT as a contributor pushing what would be considered a very Russian-friendly geopolitical narrative. And there's one interview with Michael Maloof that stands out to us in terms of this current moment where you have like this Russian factor around Donald Trump, and the idea of even the Russian component being used as like Trump is like against the neocon wars and all of this. And somebody like Michael Maloof is helping frame that narrative by blaming like going after the negative aspects of like the American foreign policy establishment who just want to get us into wars and have this strategy of tensions with countries such as Russia. But there's one moment in particular that we analyzed on our program that brings us back to this moment. And it was an interview that Michael Maloof did on RT, I believe it was the program, The Big Picture. And he was interviewed along with the former CIA analyst named Philip Giraldi, who's also
he's not an
Russian aspect of the Trump operation.
Giraldi is an officer, a CIA officer.
Yes.
Worked in Turkey, yeah.
Yeah, and he's since become like a very big critic of like, Israel's influence over U.S. politics, et cetera. But in this interview together, Maloof, it's very interesting you pointed out like where this propaganda come from. It's being pushed on the intelligence agencies from the likes of Scooter Libby, from the likes of the people.
Okay, I think Greg's connection is bad. I'm going to continue onwards here. Okay, page 251 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Okay, quote, OSP relied heavily on information from Chalabi and other Iraqi exiles, and it had close connections to various Israeli sources. Indeed, The Guardian reported that it, quote, forged close ties to a parallel ad hoc intelligence operation inside Ariel Sharon's office in Israel, specifically to bypass Mossad and provide the Bush administration with more alarmist reports on Saddam's Iraq than Mossad was prepared to authorize, unquote. The Department of Defense Inspector General released a report in February 2007 that was critical of OSP for disseminating, quote, alternative intelligence assessments, unquote, that, quote, were, in our opinion, inappropriate given that the intelligence assessments were intelligence products and did not clearly show the variance with the consensus of the intelligence community, unquote. Now, this is an aside. This is very interesting that this is also in the book, because even for elements of the so-called alternative media or conspiracy analysts where they basically don't even decipher, they just call everything of that anyone involved in Israel's involved with Mossad did it or something like that. What's so interesting about this is it really draws it out as, the way I've described the situation is that these were you could consider them, these were terrorist information cells that were constructed and attached to the side of these both national security establishments and bureaucracy, one in the U.S. Pentagon and then one in Israel in relationship to Sharon's people, basically. And this then also goes along with what we touched on last time, which was where Netanyahu was brought into the U.S. Congress basically to browbeat the Congress to that you have to do this war on Iraq. And Netanyahu was produced as if he were the voice of the entire, every single Israeli, or even every Israeli officer or official of the government. And what we begin to see more and more, this is a very specific grouping, actually, that was seriously, aggressively pushing the war in Iraq in terms of even the Israeli angle to it. This was not the entirety of the Israeli national security apparatus. This was very much this Netanyahu, Sharon, hardline Likud, which begins to be other suspicions around their background too. All right, go for it, Greg.
And I think I'm back now. I was having a shaky connection there for a few minutes, and I dropped off. And I'll go back and finish my point. My connection still seems to be shaky here, so I'll do the best I can to go through this. It's just been kind of just suddenly over the last few minutes, all of a sudden started to get shaky, so I apologize for that. But on the point, though, it is this very, very specific sect within Israel with operatives and agents that operate here domestically in the U.S. And so that is what we're specifically getting at here with this, what you're describing here. And to finish my point on Michael Maloof, the role of working with the aforementioned people in terms of their primary roles in pushing the Iraq war propaganda, Michael Maloof goes on RT. Remember, this is Russian state propaganda, and it's supposed to be the counter to the war on terror neocons and all this, right? And says that the actual propaganda for the Iraq war and the actual blame for it goes to the feet of the intelligence agencies, basically insinuating that it's the same liberal intelligence establishment, deep state foreign policy people that were trying to, that ultimately got us into the Iraq war, that are ultimately now targeting at Donald Trump. And so in doing that, Maloof on Russian state media, a man who is at the center of these circles, is directly pinning the blame for the propaganda which led to the Iraq war on the intelligence services. Not a mention of this nest of hardline pro-Israel neoconservatives in the inner circles of the Bush administration in the aftermath of September 11th that were really the people pushing the worst of the propaganda, not just the WMDs, but also the stuff literally trying to link Iraq to terrorism campaigns, link Iraq to the anthrax attacks, etc. So that is Michael Maloof, a veteran of this, who now presents himself on the within this Russian contingent, supposed to present itself as this the counter or the opposition to the war ambitions of these neocons, is there directly veteran of these operations, pushing that it was the intelligence services of the U.S. that were behind this, like your typical CIA types, rather than this particular nest of neoconservatives that really were at the heart of pushing this hardcore propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, I would call them a cell, I guess, rather than a nest, because they're actually, it's not just some sort of organic phenomenon. They're organizing towards very specific terrorist ends of some sort. In this case, the Iraq war, which was highly criminal.
Sure. Yeah, I get that. And whatever the term you want to use for it, it certainly is a very close, some pretty relatively small, closely connected, as you said, cell of individuals and connected entities that were pushing this particular propaganda. Also, just to go full circle, it's very interesting that the now deceased Rush Limbaugh, when he was, he also described the Iraq war as like the deep state tricked Bush into the Iraq war the same way that the same deep state that's targeting Donald Trump. So that's another mea culpa or a version, like a false mea culpa from a guy who was directly involved in pushing the media propaganda and getting the general public behind the war effort in Iraq, then says, well, it was Trump's enemies that pushed us into war in Iraq. Meanwhile, primary post 9/11 contributor to all this, Michael Maloof, is on Russian media saying it's the intelligence agencies, all while Trump is pardoning Scooter Libby, who's also at the center of all this. So kind of a full circle look there. But that is the interesting aspects of Michael Maloof, and I hope that was all picked up on, as I'm having problems on my end here in terms of my connection. But that is Michael Maloof goes full circle, basically, from being right at the center of this post 9/11 operation in terms of the propaganda ops against Iraq, to going full circle to Russian state media claiming it's the liberal intelligence agencies that pushed us into war. So,
and he two other things is in that that RT program where you were referring to, where he was with Phil Giraldi, CIA officer veteran. Maloof also said that it was partisan. Right? Didn't he say it was also like that? It was the Democrats.
Yes, he almost tried to present somebody like himself as almost as if people like him were trying to bring the counter narratives of what the partisan intelligence professionals were pushing. Which, of course, it would be more likely that, and there's stories out there about Michael Maloof in the aftermath of September 11th having his security clearances taken away. I believe Doug Feith may have reinstated his security clearance at one point. And so it seems to me like there would be inverse that would be true, where the Michael Maloof directly working with people like Doug Feith and David Worms, pushing this type of, almost like pushing the really heavy duty type of propaganda that he's accusing the partisan intelligence agencies of doing. And that's not to absolve aspects of the intelligence for going along with the major aspects of the lies which led to the war. But, you see that this is really just I look at this as a very BS thing for somebody like a Maloof to do, knowing that the worst of the Iraq talking points were directly pushed and advanced by people who he was in, at the very least, direct contact with. And one more thing about Michael Maloof is that it was reported, I believe, in New York Magazine by Franklin Foer in 2004 that Michael Maloof was named as Judith Miller's primary source. And of course, Judith Miller of the New York Times was the New York Times in-house reporter who was regularly pushing on the front page of the Times the weapons, the talking points which led to war in Iraq. So that's interesting, and that's from 2004. Franklin Foer, one of the major reporters on these types of things within New York Magazine at the time, reporting that Michael Maloof was Judith Miller's source in terms of a lot of the information she got, which would mean that Maloof was getting the information for the sources he would provide to Miller directly from this circle, this as you called it, this cell of people pushing this really hard propaganda. So,
yes, all right, that's so true. And Judith Miller, the other very interesting piece of that, which I think is crucial to understanding the entirety of the operations in the September and October of 2001 in the United States, which would include the anthrax attacks, which were really the crucial ones in terms of the spread of the fear of the war on terror, as Al-Qaeda could be in the Midwest and have crop dusters and could be threatening Midwestern farmers with biowarfare and that kind of thing. And what role did Judith Miller play? She was in the notorious drill of Dark Winter, which was carried out in the summer of 2001, which was a biowarfare drill where Judith Miller, quote unquote, journalist of the New York Times, who, as you pointed out, is a key cutout for the piping of this manufactured intelligence via people in the Office of Special Plans like Maloof into the New York Times. Judith Miller also played the role of the quote-unquote journalist in the Dark Winter anthrax war game itself, or terror drill itself. And James Woolsey, who, as we pointed out last time, was a signatory on a lot of these neoconservative and Project for a New American Century public letters about aggressive warfare in relationship to Iraq. James Woolsey, the former CIA director, played the role of the director of the CIA. So there's an interesting tie-in there in terms of Judith Miller as a part of this network too. And then one last thing is, you referred to Richard Pearl earlier, and we will be, one of the texts in our Antidote Deep Core text club on Clubhouse is titled Prince of Darkness, Richard Pearl, the Kingdom The Power and the End of Empire in America by Alan Weisman, which fills in some interesting background to Pearl and his even his professional contacts in a even wider scale in the Middle East than just in Israel itself. All right, so back to the text, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt, Chapter 8, Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East, page 251. Quote, the Department of Defense's Inspector General report. Okay, no, I already read that basically that the Inspector General released a report that conflicted. Okay, quote, the neoconservatives in the Pentagon and the White House not only relied heavily on Chalabi and his fellow exiles for intelligence about Iraq, they also championed him as Iraq's future leader after Saddam was gone. The CIA and the State Department, on the other hand, considered Chalabi dishonest and unreliable and kept him at arm's length. That severe judgment has now been vindicated, as we know that Chalabi and the INC fed the United States false information, and his relations with the U.S. occupation forces soon deteriorated, with Chalabi later being accused of providing classified information to Iran, a charge that he has denied.
Another interesting full circle moment as it relates to the aforementioned Ahmed Chalabi and the events surrounding Donald Trump in 2016 and what we call the more global-oriented collusion efforts which took place to ensure Donald Trump's victory in 2016 is that it came out in, I believe it was in files. I believe the investigative reporter Marcy Wheeler at Empty Wheel on Twitter. I don't know if she was the only person to report on this, but she put out that in some of these documents that came out, classified documents, that George Nader, who's a twice convicted pedophile who was involved in this Middle Eastern aspect of 2016 operation with regards to Donald Trump, had claimed that he had introduced, I believe, Dick Cheney to Ahmed Chalabi. So that's an interesting full circle moment here, going from a key player in the 2016 Trump operation to going back to this direct moment, if indeed Nader was telling the truth about introducing Chalabi and Cheney to each other. So,
well, thank you for that, Greg. And is it a Chalabi or a Chalabi? I think you're right.
Chalabi. I apologize if I pronounce his name wrong. For pronouncing his name wrong, it might be Chalabi. I'm not certain of the pronunciation.
Okay, we'll do both. I'll do Chalabi and you do Chalabi, and we'll have it at least get it right sometimes. Okay.
Potato.
Well, one of them's correct, but I know. One other thing about Maloof too, and maybe we'll cover more of this and what it might mean in the future, is how quickly Maloof was welcomed into the Iranian New Horizon conference scene, which is sort of seen as, beyond anti-neoconservative. It's sort of seen as potentially, hardcore anti-Zionist, has been accused of being anti-Jewish at some level, and yet it appears that Maloof has never even really been questioned by the people who go there about his role in this manufacture of this criminal war against a majority Muslim country.
Yeah, and New Horizon would be like a who's who of like this gathering of, like, as you mentioned, like it's been called anti-Zionist, it's been called anti-Jewish. I don't want to get into the, that's not a conversation for here nor there, any merits or non-merits of those claims. But in terms of what it represents like, at least ostensibly, like a who's who of like serious American and Western figures who are opposed to, or at least seen as being opposed to the, if not the entire, many of the aspects of the global war on terror post September 11th, certainly like the American neoconservative class that's beholden to things such as the Israel Lobby and is seen as being the pushers for these wars. And yes, Michael Maloof is like, there's been no scrutiny of him coming from this, inserting himself into this community that's supposed to be at this serious conference of, for better or worse, dissidents of the, might call the American Empire, whatever term you want to use for it. And so, yeah, there's been little to no scrutiny of it. And we saw, I'm not going to talk about it in depth here. There was one attempt to try to ask Maloof about his history, and it was very much, I don't think Maloof was very forthright in answering, but I mean, there's been next to no scrutiny of Michael Maloof in terms of this background and him just being invited with open arms into this conference, which is being seen as being held by a government of one of maybe the main ultimate target of this war on terror hardline hawks, as standing against all of this, and no scrutiny for him. He's just welcomed there and is able to interact and maybe make speeches, who knows, at these conferences. And it's very, I would say, troubling to say the least. But
yes. All right. Page 252 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, the neoconservatives' hopes that he meaning Chalabi, would be the, quote, George Washington of Iraq, unquote, fared no better than their other pre-war forecasts. So why did neoconservatives embrace Chalabi? The INC leader had gone to considerable lengths to establish close ties with individuals and groups in the lobby, and he had especially close links with Jinsa, where he had been, quote, a frequent guest at board meetings, symposia, and other events since 1997, unquote. He also cultivated close ties with pro-Israel organizations like AIPAC, AEI, the Hudson Institute, and WINEP. Max Singer, who helped found the Hudson Institute, described Chalabi as a quote-unquote, a quote, rare find. He's deep in the Arab world, and at the same time he is fundamentally a man of the West, unquote. When an embattled Chalabi returned to give his 8th address to the AEI in early November 2005, that think tank's president introduced him as a, quote, very great and very brave Iraqi patriot, liberal and liberator, unquote. Another big supporter of Chalabi, I keep going back and forth to the pronunciations, I apologize, was Bernard Lewis, who argued that the INC leader should be put in charge of Iraq after Baghdad fell. In return for the lobby's support, Chalabi pledged to foster good relations with Israel once he gained power. According to Faith's former law partner, L. Mark Zell, Chalabi also promised to rebuild the pipeline that once ran from Haifa in Israel to Mosul in Iraq.
I believe this pipeline is going to be a key theme of the Gary Vogler book we're going to be talking about after we finish covering the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy, correct?
I believe so. And it's interesting that how much of this, the details that Gary Vogler tells from the innermost inner circles of the Iraq war for oil hypothesis, he saw what happened. And a lot of that, what he saw, was presaged in this book in terms of talking about this background here, where even the potential oil interests were directly linked to his Israeli interests also. But Vogler fills in a bunch there in terms of how this all went down in order to actually figure it out. So that's very interesting. All right. And Mark Zell, key figure too. All right. Page 252 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, this was precisely what pro-Israel proponents of regime change wanted to hear, so they backed Chalabi in return. The journalist Matthew Berger laid out the essence of the bargain in the Jewish Journal. Quote, the INC saw improved relations as a way to tap Jewish influence in Washington and Jerusalem and to drum up increased support for its cause. For their part, the Jewish group saw an opportunity to pave the way for better relations between Israel and Iraq, if and when the INC is involved in replacing Saddam Hussein's regime, unquote. Not surprisingly, Nathan Gutman reports that, quote, the American Jewish community and the Iraqi opposition, unquote, had for years, quote, taken pains to conceal, unquote, the links between them. Okay, just a quick aside here is that we noted in the first part of this reading of the Israel Lobby chapter on the Iraq War that Mearsheimer and Walt make certain analytical presumptions or assertions that they don't back up with evidence for why they believe that or logic for why they believe that, and which included, we pointed out in the first part, that their assertion that none of the people, none of these networks that worked on manufacturing the war in Iraq could have foreseen or did foresee the chaos that could have happened afterwards. Now, that is just an assertion, and they do not put forth evidence for that non-knowledge, nor do they put forth the other potential analyses that there might, just as we pointed out, obviously certain elements in the West sought to give the Soviet Union its Vietnam in Afghanistan. And so it's not beyond the pale. It's not a wild conspiracy theory to imagine that there might be elements that would desire to use destabilization, chaos in a region, and then also for some element to be interested in a U.S. quagmire also. And those might be different or competing interests or aligned interests of some sort. I mean, and this is the third document or text that we intend to read from in relationship to doing this deep dive on the origins of the Iraq War is the Clean Break white paper itself, which describes really, you can really, at the very least, do an intuitive analysis of it that basically shows exactly what we're seeing, including what is titled in the Clean Break paper, rollback in Syria, in a very different way, where it calls directly for overthrow in Iraq. It calls for rollback and things like containment in relationship to the Syrian government and Assad.
Yeah. And that's interesting. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I just want to bring this up real quick in relation to what you're saying about the clean break. And we'll talk about this more in depth, but understanding also, even going back to someone like Michael Maloof, who now works in Russian, now as a contributor to Russian, state-funded media RT, and of course is a champion of like the Russian insertion into Syria as opposed to the Western involvement in Syria. That becomes very key language if we want to look at even the context of like the operation in Syria as just simply being outside of like this, what is a very, very prevalent narrative within aspects of what you might call alternative media, that simply that the Russians were there at the behest of Assad to counter the bad guys in the West who wanted to overthrow him. So it's all interesting. We'll get back to that, but I just wanted to bring that up in terms of like that's key language that you to pick up on in terms of like the of like what this document, what these war agendas as far as the war on terror means in Syria goes, and in terms of like what it actually is and is not represented. So I just want to pick up on that real quick.
Okay, thank you, Greg. All right, so we are on the bottom of page 252 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, the neoconservatives and their allies did not operate in a vacuum, of course, and they did not lead the United States to war by themselves. As emphasized earlier, the war would probably not have occurred absent the September 11th attacks, which forced President Bush and Vice President Cheney to consider adopting a radically new foreign policy. Okay, and aside here's another one, where the question is begged, right? Of course. Yes, of course. 9/11, another gaping, missing piece of the information and the analysis in relationship to these very similar networks. But we will let that be for now. But I just want to point out some of these places of lack in their analysis while they fill in some of the background specifically around the Iraq War, basically better, more thoroughly than anybody had, I would say, in a published format at that point. Okay. So back to the text. very bottom of page 252 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, neoconservatives like Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, who had been urging regime change in Iraq since early 1998, were quick to link Saddam Hussein with 9/11, even though there was no evidence that Saddam was involved, and to portray his overthrow as critical to winning the war on terror. The lobby's actions were a necessary but not sufficient condition for war. Indeed, Richard Pearl made precisely this point to George Packer in a discussion about the role that the neoconservatives played in making the Iraq War happen. Quote, if Bush had staffed his administration with a group of people selected by Brent Scowcroft and Jim Baker, Pearl noted, which might well have happened, then it could have been different, because they would not have carried into it the ideas that the people who wound up in important positions brought to it, unquote. The New York Times columnist Thomas L. Friedman offered a similar appraisal in May 2003, telling Ari Shavit of Haaretz that Iraq was, quote, the war the neoconservatives wanted, the war the neoconservatives marketed. I could give you the names of 25 people, all of whom are at the moment within a 5-block radius of this office in Washington, D.C., who, if you exiled them to a desert island a year and a half ago, the Iraq War would not have happened, unquote.
This was the article that I had referred to, I think, towards the beginning of our first stream, was this, what you just mentioned there, the quote from Thomas Friedman of the New York Times about the architects of the Iraq War being within a short radius of each other and here in the United States. And so, good follow-up. And I believe the title of that article would be in Haaretz, White Man's Burden, from April 3rd, 2003, so by Ari Shavit.
Whoa, very interesting. All right. Next section here, actually. Quote, page 253 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, we agree completely with Pearl's and Friedman's observations, while recognizing that it was a combination of individuals' ideas and circumstances that came together to produce the ultimate decision for war. The next section is titled, Was Iraq a War for Oil? Quote, some readers might concede that the Israel Lobby had some influence over the decision to invade Iraq, but argue that its overall weight in the decision-making process was minimal. Instead, many American and foreign observers appear to think that oil, not Israel, was the real motivation behind the invasion of Iraq in 2003. In one variant of this story, the Bush administration was determined to control the vast reserves of oil in the Middle East, because that would give the United States enormous geopolitical leverage over potential adversaries. Conquering Iraq, according to this scenario, was seen by the administration as a giant step towards achieving that goal. An alternative version sees the oil-producing states, and especially the oil companies, as the real culprits behind the Iraq War, driven primarily by a desire for higher prices and greater profits. Even scholars who are often critical of Israel, here, listen to this, Greg. Okay, even scholars who are often critical of Israel and of the lobby, such as Noam Chomsky, apparently subscribe to this idea, which was popularized in filmmaker Michael Moore's 2004 documentary Fahrenheit 9/11. Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting that Chomsky's brought up there, and Chomsky was a critic of the Israel Lobby, and basically, I think he published writings that were contrary, basically, that almost going back to the traditional Israel, the Americans use Israel for what it needs and all this, and that's the extent and depth of the relationship. But what he's describing in terms of like Iraq, what is being described here in terms of the classification of Iraq as war for oil, even by people who are usually very critical of aspects of Israel, of the Israeli state, that by and large, like you look, for example, at we called your more left-wing, progressive, anti-war circles that had coalesced around opposition to the Iraq War, and there was a virtually uniform. And I think you were a little more involved than I was. I'm a little younger than you in terms of maybe in terms of remembering directly the anti-war movement that rose around Iraq in 2003 to the point to where I believe up to 1 million people took to the streets in various U.S. cities. That by and
Actually,
large,
around the world,
yes,
pre the war, yes.
Yes, but the narrative that was largely in place, I think, that was very largely uniform narrative of Iraq as being a war for oil, and these aspects that are really brought out, and I think a big part of what made this book, among other things, a controversy, is that the issue of Israel and all these aspects surrounding it, I believe, were, I mean, I know still to this day, have very, by and large, gone untouched. If you look at like the major like anti-war groups, peace groups that were both around in 2003 and that are still, many still around now to this day, all pin the Iraq war on oil and on Bush administration greed. So
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting to see Mearsheimer and Walt call out these two figures in their own academic way of Chomsky and Michael Moore. And hearkening back to our series from 9/11 to 11/9, which deals with the deep background of the Trump installation and the networks that surrounded him, that, of course, was a reference to Michael Moore making the film about Bush in 9/11, so-called, called Fahrenheit 9/11, to then making the book about what went wrong. I mean, the film of what went wrong, quote unquote, with Donald Trump in making Fahrenheit 11/9. And we just noticed this immediately. We also noticed the tie-in to his parent agent in Hollywood, Rahm Emanuel's brother Ari Emanuel, and how Donald Trump was close to those networks also.
yes, indeed, and once again, much like the questionable portrayal, like the, you might call the limitations in terms of Michael Moore's perspective on September 11th, that it seems that, like, it largely begins and ends. There's some questions about Saudi Arabia. Why did the Bush family fly? Why were Saudis flown out on September 11th and all this and that? But then even going outside September 11th stuff, like Michael Moore being a key pusher of Iraq was a war for oil and greed and all this, and it goes back to this again. And obviously the Emanuel family being key players in this in terms of Ari's direct relationship with both Trump and Michael Moore. And then in addition to that, of course, the role of Emanuel's brother, Rahm Emanuel, being seen as maybe like the primary pro-Israel mover and shaker in the early Obama administration. And then, of course, the Emanuel's father, I believe, had a background involved in I believe I found out it was the Irgun, the Zionist, one of the Zionist, primary Zionist terrorist groups in the lead up to the 1948 establishment of the State of Israel. So
out of which a lot of many prime ministers came from, I think. Yeah.
Yes, or variations of those different, but I think pretty close ideologically oriented to each other groups that were operating.
And by the way, Greg, there was a controversy as Obama came in and Emanuel was named his chief of staff, and the father had made some kind of comment about he'd been asked whether Rahm being the chief of staff was going to be, was he going to assert influence? Was it going to be good really for Israel? Is what I believe the question was about. And I think it was Israeli press. And the father, Emanuel, basically said, he answered in this way. He said, of course it is. What is he going to be? The janitor? And so people took it almost as almost like an sort of an anti-Palestinian, almost like an ethnic, like a supremacist kind of statement of some sort. Okay, I'm going to continue reading.
Oh, real quick, it's interesting that I just stumbled upon this the other day. There seems to be a controversy that Rahm Emanuel being talked about being brought into the Biden administration. He's been discussed as both a transportation secretary and for a top ambassador role. I've heard, I think, ambassador to Japan, and there were indications that even Biden himself was not for bringing Rahm Emanuel in, but that at the very least, that there's been talk of that causing a controversy, and it could be a similar level controversy as over what happened with, say, somebody like Neera Tanden. But so it's interesting that Rahm Emanuel's name floats around for Biden administration positions, and there seems to be at the least that's been kept at arm's length, at least over the last few months. So
Definitely. It's very interesting. He keeps popping up and be like, no, he's not. Rahm Emanuel's also not going to be heading transportation either, or whatever it was. Yeah. Okay. Here we back are on page 2, top of page 254 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, the claim that the conquest of Iraq was mainly about oil has a certain prima facie plausibility, given the importance of oil to the world economy. But this explanation faces both logical and empirical difficulties. As emphasized in Chapter 2, U.S. policymakers have long been concerned about who controls Persian Gulf oil. They have been especially concerned about the danger that one state might control all of it. The United States has been involved with various oil-producing countries in the Gulf, but no American government, including the Bush administration, has seriously considered conquering the major oil-producing countries in that region to gain coercive leverage over other countries around the world. The United States might consider invading a major oil-producing state if a revolution or an embargo caused its oil to stop flowing into world markets. But that was not the case with Iraq. Saddam was eager to sell his oil to any customer willing to pay for it. Moreover, if the United States wanted to conquer another country in order to gain control of its oil, Saudi Arabia, with larger reserves and a smaller population, would have been a much more attractive target. Plus, bin Laden was born and raised in Saudi Arabia, and 15 of the 19 terrorists who struck the United States on September 11th were Saudis. None were from Iraq. Okay, just an aside here, of course, you just have to note their assertion of their analysis of the background here of September 11th and all of that, but not going deep into it right now. Okay, middle of page 254 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, if control of oil were Bush's real objective, 9/11 would have been an ideal pretext to act. Occupying Saudi Arabia would not have been a simple task, but it would almost certainly have been easier than trying to pacify the large, restive, and well-armed population of Iraq. Okay, I need to make a point here, because this ties directly to Noam Chomsky's public. It shows the hypocrisy, the public hypocrisy or illogic to Noam Chomsky's assertions in relationship to they point out what he said about the Israel Lobby and Iraq, but then what he also says about September 11th and physics and architects and engineers for 9/11 truth. He always talks about, if they'd wanted to, if this were a false flag operation, they would have blamed it on the Saudis, and so he's basically making this point here for them in some way. And it's Walt and Mearsheimer are actually making an interesting point, I think, which is very, very true, whether or not their analysis of the real or deep origins of September 11th are true, which I would say they are not, but that they're on the surface of it, they're out Chomskying Chomsky by saying if this had been about Saudi Arabia, then 15 of 19 9/11 hijackers would supply the perfect moment to stage an invasion of a even bigger oil country.
Yeah, and it's like where it's this idea that, September 11th is only considered a successful, they could only be considered like some type of successful false flag if why are they targeting Iraq? Well, it's obvious why they're targeting Iraq. It's because Iraq is seen as a prize by the people who, if you look at the more false flaggy aspects of September 11th, certainly in terms of the people who obviously benefited from the attacks, and I would say also you'd have to look at, of course, we can go back to our series from 9/11 to 11/9 where we talk more about 9/11 itself. But obviously the architects and the people who at the very least took advantage of, or coming from the aspect of a Walt and Mearsheimer, at the very least, people who took advantage of September 11th, Iraq was a prize, so of course they would use this to target Iraq. Like, Chomsky, I don't know, he's not dumb enough. He's not naive enough to believe this is reality. And I would say, Chomsky is the classic example of his abandonment of his own professed principle that he talked about in the Vietnam days of what the responsibility of an intellectual is. So.
Yes, and it's in these lines where certain facts you can't get Chomsky to even address certain facts, and then certain lines of logic are they're sort of de facto straw men of some sort. They don't even hold together really, and so it's very interesting. I think that Mearsheimer and Walt called Chomsky and Michael Moore as the two big progenitors or pushers of this. Really, the cover up of the Israel lobby's central role in this Iraq war, as they're laying out. Okay. We are midway through page 254 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. Okay. Quote, there's also hardly any evidence that oil interests were actively pushing the Bush administration to invade Iraq in 2002 to 3. In 1990-91, by contrast, Saudi Arabia's leaders clearly pressed the first Bush administration to use force to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. They feared, like many American policymakers at the time, that Saddam might next invade Saudi Arabia, which would place much of the region's oil under his control. Prince Bandar, the Saudi ambassador to the United States, worked closely with pro-Israel groups here to build support for ousting Saddam from Kuwait. But the story was very different in the run-up to the Second Gulf War. This time, Saudi Arabia publicly opposed using American force against Iraq. Saudi leaders feared that a war would lead to the breakup of Iraq and destabilize the Middle East. And even if Iraq remained intact, the Shia were likely to ascend to power, which worried the Sunnis who ran Saudi Arabia not only for religious reasons, but also because it would increase Iran's influence in the region. In addition, the Saudis faced growing anti-Americanism at home, which was likely to get worse if the United States launched a preventative war against Iraq. Nor were the oil companies, which generally seek to curry favor with big oil producers like Saddam's Iraq or the Islamic Republic of Iran, major players in the decision to conquer Iraq. They did not lobby for the 2003 war, which most of them thought was a foolish idea. As Peter Beinart noted in the New Republic in September of 2002, quote, "It isn't war that the American oil industry has been lobbying for all these years. It's the end of sanctions," unquote. All right, good point, Peter Beinart.
That's interesting. Now, that's interesting if you look at the current moment in terms of like Peter Beinart is the critic of Israel, like the U.S. establishment liberal critic of Israel, as opposed to the saying that, at least being that clear about something like that. I don't know how forthright he's been about Israel lobby in terms of pushing for the Iraq war, but even a statement like that right there by Peter Beinart is seen as an enemy by a lot of these by aspects of the progressive community for being like an American apologist or whatever. Ultimately, seems that even saying something like that, that's further than like some of these anti-war heroes, like intellectual heroes, etc., willing to go on that mark. So that's interesting in terms of current moment of Beinart and some of the people who consider him to be less than a good source of information or whatnot because of his U.S. establishment connections.
Super interesting, actually, because I would even go ahead and say, okay, place Walt and Mearsheimer and then Peter Beinart versus Chomsky and Michael Moore in terms of these issues. And sure,
throw Max Blumenthal in there as well. That was the name I was kind of thinking of. So
yeah, and sure, you get to certain places, and there's an issue there, as we point out with Mearsheimer and Walt, where they make assertions of the negative about what this network that helped create the Iraq war didn't think, or what they did not expect in terms of the sort of obviously anticipated chaos as they're laying out here. And you contrast that with where this kind of section where they're giving all of this factual assertions and background of the point that they're trying to make. And so when and then Beinart basically, okay, sure, like he doesn't go to some of these places, including places around the severity of the power of the Israel lobby and stuff like that. But when the analysis came front and center, he basically put the accurate historical factual record on his journalistic record when it mattered in the run up to the Iraq war. where he was basically saying, no, the oil companies are interested in the sanctions issue,
And therefore, what the oil interests, if you want to lift sanctions, then you would probably want to try to bring an end to some of this hard propaganda about like the alleged nefarious activities of Iraq and Saddam Hussein in terms of sponsoring terrorism and all this and building these deadly weapons that could just, and so it runs contrary. It really does. And so, wow, it's amazing.
Meanwhile, Noam Chomsky will basically say, well, if you think that, this is just an ethnic lobby, he'll say that's pushing this war, then all you have to do, what all the peace activists have to do is lobby the commerce, your local commerce organization to stop the war because it's bad for business, is the way he usually puts it. And to me, it smells of bad faith. I'm sorry, but that's my assertion.
Ultimately, I think it ultimately is. And but just what you're pointing out there about like the difference between the oil companies, like they wanted into these sanctions so they can do business. This hardcore propaganda push for war is not, it's going to be, especially then you're then that becomes a question of the types of people who would be brought into power in Iraq in the aftermath. It's like that's directly contrary to like the desire to do business in Iraq and have sanctions lifted. All this war propaganda, by and large, goes against that. Now, were there big oil people who may have supported the Bushes and all that? By and large, it seems that like this is just directly contradictory to a major push for war. So,
okay, all right. Top of page 255 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, the oil companies, as is almost always the case, wanted to make money, not war. The next section is titled Dreams of Regional Transformation. Quote, the Iraq War was not supposed to be a costly quagmire. Just noting that they will assert this. My sense is that they are not going to back it up. But, okay, just noting that. Okay. Quote, the Iraq War was not supposed to be a costly quagmire. Rather, it was intended as the first step in a larger plan to reorder the Middle East in ways that would benefit long-term American and Israeli interests. Okay, we have to address this at this point because they just pointed out just a couple sections earlier about the manufacturing of the intelligence as basically a terrorist, in my words, a terrorist information cell attached by the Douglas Feith crew to the side of the Pentagon with the Sharon crew in Israel, and not where the rest of Israeli intelligence would go. And so them basically asserting that this was going to benefit quote unquote American and Israeli interests, that was the purpose of it at some level, I think is actually an analytical stretch, but I'll let that go for now, and we'll get back to the text.
Well, and I'll throw in a quick aside here is that to follow up on that, it's similar to and that's why and that's where this idea, on one hand, yes, this vital, crucial role of the American Israel lobby and on all of its arms being their crucial role in terms of pushing for it. But even the difference between that's saying that this is simply just to strengthen whatever Israel wants per se. That's similar to saying the Donald Trump administration desired for that was pushing for the best interest of American security, what the American, and I go back to this full circle moment because now, even with relation to Iran and look at the information about, as it relates to Israel and Iran, that Netanyahu is constantly pushing this imminent Iranian nuclear threat against many people within the Israeli intelligence, within military circles. And so ultimately you look at that and it becomes that doesn't just completely explain things. It's not just simply to strengthen U.S. and Israel's hand. No, it's for a very specific set of interests, and in many cases run outside of the core interests of many aspects of the establishments of both of these respective countries. So it's much deeper, and that's something for me, it's taken me some time to understand that and to comprehend that. But it's much deeper than just simply advancing Israeli geopolitical interest. It's much more than that. And it's something big, much bigger than that going on. That goes back to the Iraq War, and it also applies to this current moment with Iran. So
Yeah, it's a little bit of a simplistic assertion and an analysis by them after the detail of all of these other assertions that they're making, that they basically just hop to Israeli and American interests. It was meant to be quick and all of that. And sure, that was like the surface wording. And so if that's fair enough, if you go look at like sort of what we might call the paleo neocons or the Israel second neocons, sure, that's very possible that that was their understanding, that was their desire, that was their intent. However, these other networks that actually are being pointed at by Mearsheimer and Walt is actually manufacturing the intelligence, and they're saying no, this was beyond Wolfowitz, right? Wolfowitz might even be one of these paleo neocons, as we might call them, or Israel second neocons, who probably did anticipate this sort of easy transcendence and then the rolling out of democracy and the help of the American and Israeli interests and all that. But that's not who actually manufactured the intelligence, as Mearsheimer and Walt point out.
And that's why this understanding, like this limited scope of like the understanding of who the neocons are, and simply making them out to just simply be like the never Trumpers who are responsible for things like PNAC, the Bill Kristols of the world. And yes, they certainly took advantage of the propaganda of the faulty fabricated intelligence being produced and all this to push for their own purposes. But then maybe that purpose is like a strong Israel working together with the U.S. like for our purposes. Yes, we need that. But this is what we're going at, like the primary, like the main push for the lies, the actual like intelligence that justified the war effort is outside of that altogether. So,
all right, back to the text, page 255 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt from the chapter Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East. Quote, I'll go back to the beginning. The Iraq War, quote, the Iraq War was not supposed to be a costly quagmire. Rather, it was intended as the first step in a large plan to reorder the Middle East in ways that would benefit long-term American and Israeli interests. Specifically, the United States was not just going to remove Saddam Hussein from power and go home. The invasion and occupation would, in this dream, quickly turn Iraq into a democracy, which would then serve as an attractive model for people living in the various authoritarian states in the region. The results from Iraq would trigger a cascade of democratic dominoes, although it still might be necessary to use the sword to spread democracy to some countries in the Middle East besides Iraq. But once go for it. But once
I was just going to say, like, I'm going to click here just to mention here, I think that there may be a bit of a, similar to what we described just now, is a bit simplistic in terms of like just simply classifying the war as just for U.S. and is for ambitions of Israel. This here, I think that there's a bit still of like a lumping in of like this what we talk about, like the Bill Kristol set of neocons actually did push for like Iraq, at least publicly in their public justifications for it, as war for democracy, all this, and the idea of like the dominoes and all this falling of and leading to democracy and all this. But at its core, the same network we're identifying here, I don't think, they weren't in it for bringing democracy to these countries. So I think that there's also a bit of like a lumping in of like the here where like the full ambitions of this, of the pushers of the major pushers of the actual faulty intel, etc., that led to the war, were not in this for like this desire for democracy and for the dominoes of tyranny to fall in the region. So.
For sure. And it's, in a certain way, it's basically taking a bill of goods or some kind of propagandistic marketing, really, as the thing itself, as the intent itself. That's what it seems like. And so, then that's why we have to continue to dig into the background of one of the main marketers of this alleged idea, Natan Sharansky. Because, it would make a very big analytical deal just for historical sake, let alone the ability to actually understand the current moment, to understand Natan Sharansky and his pitch for the new anti-Semitism, or his pitch for the new democracy project to roll it out in the Middle East, or or his role at the Jewish Agency for Israel post 9/11, and all of that, which was also, people can go back to our work on from 9/11 to 11/9 and look at the relationship of Bernard Kerik to Eitan Wertheimer, who was the former, I think, head of the Jewish Agency for Israel Board of Governors, I believe. But so it would make a big deal to understand Sharansky as not who he is said to be, as just some kind of Soviet refusnik, Jewish activist of conscience who was able to escape the clutches of the Soviet Union, and then just somehow continued to have to deal with the Soviet deep state in terms of the Russian sphere gangsters who took money from right when he got to Israel and all of that. And so that there would be an entirely different analytical shape that would appear if Natan Sharansky and all his works, his public works, quote unquote, were to be seen from a different light. I think that would be crucial in terms of turning the corner on this analysis about the chaos and the quagmire and all of that, and what potentially geopolitical interests may be behind some of that. So, but we'll put that off until later. And then what the issue is, it's hard to find texts that speak to that in English is one issue, but we have a little bit that we'll return to. All right. Page 255 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, "But once democracy took hold across the region, regimes friendly to Israel and the United States would be the norm. The conflict between Israel and the Palestinians would, in the words of the quote-unquote clean break study, be quote-unquote transcended. Other regional rivalries would be muted, and the twin problems of terrorism and nuclear proliferation would largely disappear." Vice President Cheney laid out this ambitious rationale for regional transformation in the speech to the VFW convention on August 26, 2002, opening the administration's campaign to sell the Iraq War. Quote, "When the gravest of threats are eliminated," unquote, he said, quote, "the freedom-loving peoples of the region will have a chance to promote the values that can bring lasting peace. Extremists in the region would have to rethink their strategy of jihad. Moderates throughout the region would take heart, and our ability to advance the Israeli-Palestinian peace process would be enhanced," unquote. Jeez. Cheney would repeat these arguments on several occasions over the next 6 months. President Bush spoke with similar enthusiasm about regional transformation as he made the case for war against Iraq. On February 26, 2003, he told an audience at AEI that the United States aims to, quote, "cultivate liberty and peace in the Middle East," unquote. He emphasized that, quote, "the world has a clear interest in the spread of democratic values because stable and free nations do not breed the ideologies of murder. They encourage the peaceful pursuit of a better life, and there are hopeful signs of a desire for freedom in the Middle East," unquote. Furthermore, he claimed, quote, "success in Iraq could also begin a new stage for Middle Eastern peace and set in motion progress towards a truly democratic Palestinian peace," unquote. Go for it.
Oh, this is interesting because I believe, and I could be wrong about this, but I believe that one of the I don't know if it applies to these particular speeches or not, but I do believe that I think Bush's primary speechwriter post September 11th was actually David Frum, and David Frum would fall in this category of what we have identified as paleo neoconservatives, those who are more in line for like this, to incline to talk about war in terms of pushing for democracy and all this and et cetera. So it's interesting, like if Bush is publicly pushing this, and very if it is coming from the likes of David Frum, then if he's publicly pushing this, then this still runs contrary to like I think many of the goals of like where the major propaganda push in terms of producing the intel, etc. The deep as you called it, the particular interests of those who are pushing for these interests. We've been talking about this entire time. So once again, if this is the case, then it would at least run somewhat contrary in terms of like the major, deepest level architects and creators and disseminators of the fake intelligence, etc. If that's indeed coming from like the likes of a David Frum. So that's Bush's public rhetoric, but it is running, I think, contrary to the actual goals of like the people who are putting together the faulty fake intelligence, etc.
And the other thing about it is that part of the other thing that makes it seem on the surface that this was just not unintended consequences is that basically all of this sort of comes to fruition, except in a sort of opposite fashion in terms of the interpretation of it, right? As we're seeing, that's why we read the Trump installation backwards towards these events themselves. And because you can see in the wake of Trump, you have what they're calling the normalization or the peace process of the Israelis and many of their Arab neighbors. And then as they talked about, the quote unquote Palestinian peace has been transcended. Basically, it's known now that the peace process has ultimately, at this point, led to a sham, and there's no two-state solution, to where even people like Peter Beinart, who were so accurate about some of these things, have now publicly come to an open reckoning that the two-state solution and the quote-unquote peace process have been quote-unquote transcended, right? And so you read that word transcended in many different ways, and they obviously have been transcended. And then you have the Kushner pushed so-called peace plan with the Palestinians, which was just a sort of an economic colonization with some cyber scraps put to the Palestinians to continue their role as a compliant potential workforce moving forward, and then maybe offer them some kind of totally controlled canton that you could say, well, it's not quite a state, but it's the Palestinian peace process has been transcended. So that word transcended, which comes directly from the Clean Break paper, is like doing a lot of heavy lifting here. And it's interesting that, Mearsheimer it's fair enough. Mearsheimer and Walt are looking at this in not, less than 4 years after the Iraq War and only a half a decade after 9/11. So they didn't actually see, they wrote this before our vantage point, where we've been able to see how this all actually went down in relationship to how some of it ended up in terms of Trump, was where a lot of these payoffs of the quote unquote transcendent aspect of these plans comes to fruition. So
it would have been very interesting if this book had been written. I mean, look, it was written when it was, and I mean, I think a ton of benefit to take out of it, regardless when it was written. But it would have been interesting if some of these aspects of things relating to the Palestinian matter and these other factors had been written about, say, during the Obama administration, when there was a very serious, there was a pretty serious the disagreement, would be putting it lightly, between Obama administration and this, and once again Benjamin Netanyahu back in power, and all of the and everything that brings about. So it would have been interesting to have this type of account like followed up on, or maybe even followed up on in later on with the benefit of more information. So
yes, I'd actually be very interested to get John Mearsheimer's current perspective of the Israel lobby 2021. So that would be very interesting. All right, back to the text. Page 256 of the Israel lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, This ambitious strategy, grounded in an almost theological belief in the transformative power of freedom, was a dramatic departure from previous U.S. policy. And there was certainly no indication before 9/11 that either Bush or Cheney would embrace it. Indeed, both men, as well as National Security Advisor Rice, were on record as being opposed to the ambitious kind of nation-building that was at the heart of regional transformation, and Bush had sharply criticized the Clinton administration for its emphasis on nation-building during the 2000 campaign. So what had produced this shift? According to a March 2003 story in the Wall Street Journal, the critical driving forces behind this major change in U.S. Middle East policy were Israel and the neoconservatives in the lobby. The headline says it all, quote, President's Dream, changing not just regime, but a region. A pro-U.S. democratic area is a goal that has Israeli and neoconservative roots, unquote. Charles Krauthammer says this grand scheme to spread democracy across the Middle East was the brainchild of Natan Sharansky, the Israeli politician whose writings are said to have impressed President Bush. But Sharansky was hardly a lone voice in Israel. In fact, Israelis across the political spectrum maintained that toppling Saddam would alter the Middle East to Israel's advantage. Writing in the New York Times in early September 2002, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak argued that, quote, putting an end to Saddam Hussein's regime will change the geopolitical landscape of the Arab world, unquote. He claimed that, quote, an Arab world without Saddam Hussein would enable many from this generation, leaders about to come into power, to embrace the gradual democratic opening that some of the Persian Gulf states and Jordan have begun to enjoy, unquote. Barak also maintained that toppling Saddam would, quote, create an opening for forward movement on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, unquote. Okay, on the side here, so this is good. This fills out that this was, at the very least, you have Ehud Barak in the mix, pointing this out. And of course, using the totally weaponized and inaccurate term as put forth by the American Anthropological Society of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I would point out in Thomas Soros's book, State of Terror, how terrorism created modern Israel. The very first note he makes is about how the usage of that phrase, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is totally not accurate. Okay, back to the text. Page 256 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, in August 2002, Yuval Steinitz, a Likud party member of the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, told the Christian Science Monitor, quote, after Iraq is taken by U.S. troops and we see a new regime installed, as in Afghanistan, and Iraqi bases become American bases, it will be very easy to pressure Syria to stop supporting terrorist organizations like Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad, to allow the Lebanese army to dismantle Hezbollah and maybe to put an end to the Syrian occupation in Lebanon. If this happens, we will really see a new Middle East, unquote. Similarly, Aluf Ben reported in Haaretz in February 2003 that, quote, senior IDF officers and those close to Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, such as National Security Advisor Ephraim Halevi, paint a rosy picture of the wonderful future Israel can expect after the war. They envision a domino effect, with the fall of Saddam Hussein, followed by that of Israel's other enemies, Arafat, Hassan Nasrallah, Bashar Assad, the Ayatollah in Iran, and maybe even Muammar Gaddafi. Along with these leaders will disappear terror and weapons of mass destruction, unquote.
And I think, Jeremy, that there's an important distinction here between, yes, this sounds like what some of the these other people pushing, you might call paleo neocons, also wanted. But I think there's a distinct difference here, whereas that on one hand, they might be for some of these regime changes, for pushing whatever, quote unquote democracy, whatever you might believe about that, combined with pushing for a stronger American, right under the guise of American, whatever interpretation of American global leadership you might want. But this faction here, like, these interests in terms of like wanting these regimes out of power is not for like the benefit of like spreading global democracy or whatever, or even something that would ultimately like be under like ultimately some type of like American global military and economic financial power. It's not about that stuff with these people that are writing about these Israeli desires for like the transforming the region and benefiting Israel by having these regimes that are deemed as hostile to their goals out of the way. So it's a distinction to point out.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we don't know in terms of some of these Israeli voices what their intent was. It's, that same division might have been there too. I don't know.
I guess I'm going back to more or less like where we've identified with the assuming that like this is in line with the propagators of the intel in terms of like the American cell and aspects around like that we've identified around the Netanyahu gang. But there could be distinctions indeed. I think just making a generalized statement there, but
because it's interesting that they talk about overthrowing Assad, which is different than the clean break paper, which is that more conjunction aspect. So, okay, back to the text. Let's see. Here we are on page 257 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, the New York Times also reported that Halevi gave a speech in Munich in February 2003 where he said, quote, the shockwaves emerging from post-Saddam Baghdad could have wide-ranging effects in Tehran, Damascus, and in Ramallah, unquote. The author of the article noted that Israel is hoping that once Saddam Hussein is dispensed with, the dominoes will start to tumble. According to this hope, moderates and reformers throughout the region would be encouraged to put new pressure on their own governments, not accepting the Palestinian Authority of Yasser Arafat, unquote. The foreword summed up Israeli thinking about regional transformation in an article published just before the war. Quote, Israel's top political, military, and economic echelons have come to regard the looming Iraq war as a virtual deus ex machina that will turn the political and economic tables and extricate Israel from its current morass, unquote. Some might argue that Israel's leaders are too sophisticated and experienced to believe in a deus ex machina and countenance such an ambitious scheme, and too familiar with the complexities of their region to believe it could succeed. But in fact, Israel's leaders have a long history of favoring remarkably ambitious plans to remake the local map. The original Zionist dream of reestablishing a Jewish state where none had existed for nearly 2 millennia was nothing if not ambitious. And as discussed in Chapter 1, David Ben-Gurion had hoped to seize all of the West Bank, part of Lebanon, and portions of Egypt in the 1956 Suez War. Similarly, Ariel Sharon believed the invasion of Lebanon in 1982 would lead to the creation of a pro-Israel Christian state there and vanquish the PLO once and for all, thereby cementing Israel's control of the occupied territories. Given that history, it is perhaps not so surprising that many Israeli leaders held out the hope that the United States might be able to succeed where their earlier plans had failed. All right, next section, titled The Lobby's Role in Remaking the Middle East, on page 258 of The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt, Chapter 8, Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East. Quote, by 2002, many neoconservatives were also heavily invested in the idea that the United States could democratize the Middle East and make it a more friendly environment for America and Israel. They had reached that position over the course of the 1990s as they became increasingly disenchanted with U.S. foreign policy after the Cold War. Pro-Israel groups, and not only neoconservatives, have long been interested in having the U.S. military directly involved in the Middle East so that it can help protect Israel. They are especially interested in seeing large numbers of American troops permanently stationed there, but they had limited success on this front during the Cold War. because America acted as an offshore balancer in the region. Most U.S. forces designated for the Middle East, like the Rapid Deployment Force, were kept, quote, over the horizon, unquote, and out of harm's way. Washington maintained a favorable balance of power by playing local powers against each other, which is why the Reagan administration supported Saddam against revolutionary Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 through 88. This policy changed after the first Gulf War, when the Clinton administration adopted a strategy of quote-unquote dual containment. Instead of using Iran and Iraq to balance each other, with the United States shifting sides as needed, the new strategy called for stationing substantial American forces in the region to contain both of them at once. The father of dual containment was Martin Indyk, who first articulated the strategy in May 1993 at WINEP, that's the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and then implemented it as Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs at the National Security Council. As Indyk's Brookings colleague Kenneth Pollock observes, dual containment was a policy adopted largely in response to, quote, Israel's security concerns, unquote. Specifically, Israel made it clear to the Clinton administration that, quote, it was willing to move ahead in the peace process only if it felt reasonably secure, unquote, from Iran. There was considerable dissatisfaction with dual containment by the mid-1990s because it made the United States the mortal enemy of two countries that hated each other, and it forced Washington to bear the burden of containing both of them. As discussed in Chapter 10, AIPAC and other groups in the lobby not only saved the policy, they persuaded Congress and Clinton to toughen it up. The neoconservatives went even further. However, they were increasingly convinced that dual containment was not working and that Saddam Hussein had to be removed from power and replaced by a democratic government. Their thinking was reflected in the two open letters that they sent to President Clinton in early 1998, as well as their support for the Iraq Liberation Act. At about the same time, the belief that spreading democracy across the Middle East would pacify the entire area was beginning to take root within neoconservative circles. A few neoconservatives had flirted with this idea in the wake of the Cold War, but it was not widely embraced until the latter part of the 1990s. This line of thinking, of course, was evident in the 1996, quote, clean break, unquote, study that a group of neoconservatives had written for Netanyahu. By 2002, when invading Iraq had become a front-burner issue, regional transformation had become an article of faith among neoconservatives, who in turn helped make it the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy. Thus, Israeli leaders, neoconservatives, and the Bush administration all saw war with Iraq as the first step in an ambitious campaign to remake the Middle East. Conclusion. The Bush administration's plans for Iraq and the wider region have been a stunning failure. Not only is the American military stuck in a losing war, but there is little prospect of exporting democracy across the Middle East anytime soon. Iran has been the main beneficiary of this ill-conceived adventure, and it seems as determined as ever to acquire a nuclear capability. Iran. Did I say Iran or Israel?
You said Iran.
Okay, good. That's what it says.
It's interesting because if it says, it's interesting that this was I don't want to say too much about this, but it did say Iran was the beneficiary.
Yes.
That's very interesting because remember, there was a big uproar within aspects of left media when basically I believe the Intercept published an article saying just that. Whereas that is one of these aspects of things where that's a more complicated geopolitical conversation than to be had here. But there were aspects of this where, yes, indeed, Iran actually benefited from the aspects of the U.S. quagmire. Right? That's a deeper conversation, but it's something we've talked before. And I think we'll go back to in the future. But that is an interesting point to be raised, to be elaborated on. I think maybe in the future.
Yes, and then this will then eventually come into focus in relationship then, of course, of like the Belt Road Initiative, the current situation, Iran, China. I think it was just announced today that like Iran and China have this massive oil deal. And of course, all of that is in direct result of the, the Trump reneging on the JCPOA pretty much, And so that has to be factored in here, Iran's current position. And then, of course, this bigger multipolar question here.
That's very key, and that does need ultimately to be taken into consideration when doing a reevaluation of, 9/11, the post 9/11 era. Is this what you're referring to here? And it's interesting, and this circles back to some of the other programs we did recently where we talked about Thomas McCoy's article on
or Alfred
the
McCoy.
fall. Alfred McCoy's article on the fall of American global power under Trump, and basically you see the dual consequences of both the leaving of the Iran nuclear deal, opening up Iran to do business elsewhere, and then you have the turn to countries to China, and then also the weakening of the European Union and this under the guise of like a trade war with China. Meanwhile, combined with the weakening of the European Union and the isolating of the United Kingdom, you have these countries moving in, like China moving in to do business with these West countries. So it all goes back to this in terms of the bigger consequences of these policies. And so that makes for another conversation not directly related to this, but it's still it is still of relation of interest to this bigger overall topic.
All right. Page 259 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. Chapter 8, Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East. We're in the conclusion section here. Quote, Iran has been the main beneficiary of this ill-conceived adventure, and it seems as determined as ever to acquire a nuclear capability. This is their assertion too. But one other aside here is that I find the Malouf, going just back to Malouf's new role, especially during the Trump era, as this somehow neocon who found a conscience or something, where he's in Iran for the most sort of radical intellectuals of the West come to Iran to talk about things. And there's Malouf, but he's also on Russia Today in the wake of this operation, as in his central, operative involvement in the institutions, quote unquote, that created this. I find that, I find it almost as compelling in some kind of way as the question of who Natan Sharansky is and what does that represent. It's not quite as pitched, but it feels like in that realm of clarity around a sort of synecdoche for this bigger picture of what this is.
It's very true. Whether it's Natan Sharansky pitching Iraq as a war of democracy, or whether it's Michael Malouf on RT, ultimately what these things ultimately do is they have the consequence of just reflecting simply badly upon America and American foreign policy. So that seems to always be like the result of these types of even things that aren't even like directly like American foreign policy, which we talked about earlier, like with with Michael Malouf blaming the intelligence agencies for being at the forefront of pushing the fake intelligence that led to war in Iraq. I mean, what ultimately it's ultimately just used just discredit and try to weaken American global power, for better or for worse. We've had that conversation before. We'll have it again, but not here. And to ultimately discredit the Americans on the global stage. That ultimately seems to be how they ultimately seem to have the impact of doing, which ultimately does and that ends up opening up these other powers to come in and like, for example, China and Iran, for example.
Yeah, but I mean, it's sort of beyond that in a way, because I just note that Malouf's little sort of propaganda sort of pisser role at RT is just a sort of indicative role. It's not that consequential per se in the much larger strain of propaganda. And Sharansky plays a different role because he doesn't appear to play up the types of things that would, quote unquote, discredit the United States or the West or things like that in a way that Malouf's direct relationship with Archie does. But more importantly, what they both did was they actually were the, quote unquote, operative or intellectual architects of the actual thing that quote unquote remade the region while destroying many, many lives, along with then it being this punctuated place where rightfully so American credibility could be questioned.
Yeah, and you're not wrong. And I guess when I'm, Sharansky, it would ultimately go back to like what you mentioned, maybe going back to what you mentioned before about the, maybe there's this goal of using democracy to bog down America in its own its own version of Afghanistan and Iraq. But maybe or maybe not. But I think you're not incorrect in terms of like of ultimately where there's convergence and there's non-convergence, but certainly there is a bigger convergence in here in what we're ultimately discussing. You're bringing up about like the significance of Malouf being involved in the Iranian sphere and being involved in the Russian sphere after being right at the center of this hard line operation, to lead us into war in Iraq. So.
Yes, and that's where I agree, like that Malouf specifically, that intersection of Iran and Russia out of the Office of Special Plans and a relationship with Judith Miller is so beyond in a certain way, beyond the Sharansky, books about democracy and stuff. It sort of really brings a lot of these questions together.
And ultimately, one more thing to take consideration on this with Malouf, these roles that he's had, whether it's Office of Special Plans, whether it's WorldNet Daily, whether it's RT, whether it's the Iranian New Horizons, none of these are in conjunction with like what we talk about as like being in conjunction with any type of like with the actual serious aspects of what might be considered an American foreign or geopolitical policy. So all this has those aspects in common as well. So.
Yes, and when you put it together with what you pointed out about the way that Malouf actually frames the quote unquote American sin in Iraq in terms of the decision as this very, it goes to the core of the American quote unquote deep state, CIA, the Democrats forcing Bush's hand and all that type of stuff. That's so obviously, some kind of agit propaganda that's not true.
And you're blaming the already the perception that viewers of say RT would have of like what the deep state is, which is basically just the people who made up the Russia myth and all this, that they're the exact same people who got us into war, when in reality, like, it's the people that you were around, Malouf, not the intelligence services that are fabricating the fake evidence against Russia that you're trying to blame for the Iraq war. So.
Okay, and I can't remember again. Oh no, so Malouf was part of Office of Special Plans and not the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group. I still don't have those two sort of separated out in my mind of what their different roles.
Yeah, I think that was the first I'd heard of that, and I'd have to go back and look again at the other group was mentioned, but certainly Malouf was right there within the inner circle with Wormser and Feith. I know that much, and Wormser was involved in the pushing of some some of these really the more out there in terms of like the propaganda pushes as far as like trying to link in like even like Saddam Hussein linking to Al Qaeda, linking to terrorism in South America, etc. So Malouf was directly involved in the pushing of like even going beyond the weapons of mass destruction and into the narrative of Iraq as the not only does Saddam want to build weapons or whatever, but Iraq is directly funding and working with people who carried out the attacks on September 11th and want to carry out further attacks. So,
all right, so we're have a few more pages here in this conclusion section of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, Chapter 8, Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East, page 259. Quote, Syria, like Iran, remains at odds with Washington, and both states have a powerful interest in having the U.S. military bogged down in Iraq. Hamas now dominates Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority is badly split, making peace with Israel even more elusive, and Hezbollah is more powerful than ever in Lebanon after having stood up to Israel in the 2006 war. We may be witnessing the, quote, birth pangs of a new Middle East, unquote, to use Secretary of State Rice's regrettable phrase, but it will almost certainly be more unstable and dangerous than the one that existed before the United States invaded Iraq. The war in Iraq has not been good for Israel either, especially since it has strengthened Iran's hand in the region. Indeed, the Forward reported in early 2007 that there is a quote-unquote growing chorus of voices in Israel who are saying that the Jewish state, quote, could find itself in more danger, unquote, now that Saddam has been removed from power. Amatzia Bahram, an Israeli expert on Iraq who argued for Saddam's ouster in pre-war interviews in the AIPAC newsletter Near East Report, now says, quote, if I knew then what I know today, January 2007, I would not have recommended going to war because Saddam was far less dangerous than I thought, unquote. Moreover, he admitted that the invasion had produced, quote, much, much more terrorism than I expected, unquote. Yuval Diskin, the head of Shin Bet, Israel's domestic security service, said in February 2006, quote, I'm not sure we won't miss Saddam, unquote. But by the way, it should be pointed out that it's often talked about how there's aspects of Shin Bet, which is, Israeli FBI, domestic security services. They are usually the ones who are referenced as being suspicious of someone like Avigdor Lieberman and his closeness with the Russian state and Putin specifically. And it is interesting. There's the documentary film. I think it's titled "The Gatekeepers" by I think an Israeli documentarian who interviewed all of the living former heads of the Shin Bet, who seem to all express some kind of regret at the long-term, quote-unquote, Israeli policy, quote-unquote, counterterrorism policy, and how it all has ended up. So, this is very interesting in relationship to whether this, the Walt and Mearsheimer saying no one could have imagined this. This was all meant to serve U.S. and Israeli interests. And then now people are having questions after the fact. Sure, some people might be having questions after the fact, but you got to imagine some analysts saw exactly what was going to happen, especially as more. If the Iraq War was originated on a proactive fraud, intelligence fraud, which it was, then you can imagine that those frauds kept going, which would include things like enticing or inciting the quagmire, which would include things like Juba the sniper and the sniping at U.S. Marines and the flaring up of tension in not only in Iraq but even in the region. It's so interesting too, talking about how Syria and Iran at that point had interest in the U.S. getting bogged down, but then imagine 10 years later and the Syrian quote unquote civil war and all that came there and all that was generated there in many ways. And there's we really would be so interesting to see what specifically Mearsheimer thought now after all of these facts.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I don't think that it's simple as it does seem to ultimately fall back on what you hear is in a lot of foreign policy circles when they talk about that it was, there's almost on one hand acknowledging it. Yes, this is what we wanted to make there were these ambitions in place. There was this group of people that pushed for this to happen. But once again, would absence of malice be the right term? That it's just that it's ultimately maybe not necessarily well-meaning, but genuine policies that weren't supposed to have the consequences,
the unintended consequences. Yeah.
Yes, and that seems to be a way a lot of narratives are often put out excusing. I apologize, my connection is getting a little shaky again, but the excusing the maliciousness in a lot of cases, an understanding of consequences. We're like, oh, well, we didn't know the consequences of what was actually going to happen. I see that going on here. It's what Sarah Kinzier describes in terms of like the Trump gang as they replace malice with incompetence. It's a variation of that.
It's definitely that. It's definitely that. And legally, basically what's going on here, and this is what usually happens in the sort of the counter aspects of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, is that they basically try to cover up or wash away any what you would call malice aforethought. If you're especially if you're dealing with a conspiracy to commit a crime, such as aggressive warfare based on deception, potentially a proxy aggressive war based on deception, then what was the full aspect of the malice aforethought? It was basically they were doing that only for quote unquote good faith intent. So, all right.
And that even goes back to things like, look forward and not backwards. Almost like this idea, like if you give like this, it was accidental, the unintended consequences. It almost gives like this impression that like, oh, well, people have learned from the previous mistakes. They won't be made again, which is we've seen like is almost always not the case. So.
Yeah, we don't want to criminalize policy is usually the phrase to use to cover that up. But if the policy is criminal, then the policy should be held accountable to criminal law. All right. Page 260 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, as the United States looks for ways to extricate itself from this disastrous situation, pressure has been growing on the Bush administration to talk with Iran and Syria and to make a concerted effort to settle the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The neoconservatives and the Israelis, of course, believe that the road to Jerusalem ran through Baghdad. Once the United States won in Iraq, they believed the Palestinians would make peace on Israel's terms. But the bipartisan Iraq study group, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and many others believe the opposite is true. The road to Baghdad runs through Jerusalem. In other words, creating a viable Palestinian state will help the United States deal with Iraq and other regional problems. Israel and the lobby have vigorously challenged this line of argument, insisting that America's troubles in Iraq have nothing to do with the Palestinians. Indeed, Haaretz reported in late November 2006, just before the release of the Iraq Study Group report, that Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, quote, hopes that the Jewish lobby can rally a Democratic majority in the new Congress to counter any diversion from the status quo on the Palestinians, unquote. Similarly, a number of pro-Israel groups still maintain that the United States should refuse to talk with Iran and Syria until these states agree to all of Washington's demands.
Just an aside, who was the incoming Speaker of the House in November 2006? None other than Nancy Pelosi. I don't know how interconnected that is, but it's interesting that Olmert is expressing all this hope for the Democratic majority to keep the status quo in place when Nancy Pelosi's coming in as Speaker of the House. Anyway, I just wanted to...
Whose father, by the way, has some kind of sports complex named after him in Israel, and by the way, secured the port bag for the upcoming Meyer Lansky mob when he was mayor of Baltimore. All right.
The Alessandro soccer stadium in I forget what town it is in Israel, but he does have a stadium named after him in Israel. So,
well, the United States may have gotten bogged down in a criminal war in Iraq that has killed hundreds of thousands of people, but at least Nancy Pelosi hasn't yet had to prove whether her loyalty to Israel will remain, even if the American Capitol in Washington, D.C. crumbles. All right, page 260 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, the Bush administration faces growing pressure to pull out of Iraq, but Israeli leaders have encouraged it to stay and finish the job. Why? Because these leaders believe that a U.S. withdrawal would jeopardize Israel's security. Both Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni and Prime Minister Olmert made this point to AIPAC's annual conference in March 2007. Livni said that, quote, in a region where impressions are important, Countries must be careful not to demonstrate weakness and surrender to extremists, unquote. Olmer was even blunter. Quote, those who are concerned for Israel's security, for the stability of the entire Middle East, should recognize the need for American success in Iraq and responsible exit, unquote. He ended his remarks by saying that, quote, when America succeeds in Iraq, Israel is safer. The friends of Israel know it. The friends who care about Israel know it, unquote. Critics castigated Olmer for making these remarks, mainly because his comments provided additional evidence that Israel had backed the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Bradley Burston, who writes for Haaretz, was especially angry with Olmer for venturing into the American debate on Iraq. He had a simple message for the prime minister, quote, stay the hell out of it, unquote. Olmer had actually expressed his support for America's continued presence in Iraq during a visit to the White House in November 2006, saying, quote, we are very much impressed and encouraged by the stability with which the great operation of America in Iraq brought to the Middle East, unquote. Even some of Israel's consistent backers were put off by Olmer's pro-war remarks, with Congressman Gary Ackerman saying, quote, I'm shocked. It's a very unrealistic observation. Most of us here understand that our policy has been a thorough and total disaster for the United States, unquote. Anti-Semite, by the way. No, I'm just joking.
That's very interesting. And I'll comment just real quick on that, this basically, it seems that Olmer, in terms of like his public indications of support, like was a little too vocal about it for some people. But I think this indicates either or maybe it's a both and or scenario here that I'm about to lay out, but this indicates either a desire by people, prominent, it seems like maybe figure like Bradley Burston would be an Israeli writing in Haaretz, the desire to keep a lid on like the role of like, particularly of like the American Israel lobby, domestic interest combined with this particular sect within that is very closely connected with the hawkish elements within the Israeli within Israel, of their direct leading role in pushing for this war, or a desire that like perceptions of like something being perceived as anti-Semitic sensitivities over real or perceived anti-Semitism over discussing this takes prevalence over trying to have an honest discussion about where the roots for this disaster came out of. So it might be an and or scenario working out here in place, though.
I imagine. I think you're right. Okay, page 261 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, given that many Americans now share Ackerman's sentiments about the war, we should not be surprised that some Israelis and their American allies have tried to rewrite the historical record to absolve Israel of any responsibility for the Iraq disaster. In March 2007, the editor of the Jerusalem Post, David Horowitz, wrote about, quote, the false notion that Israel encouraged the U.S. to fight the Iraq War, unquote. Similarly, Shai Feldman, former head of the Jaffe Center for Strategic Studies and now head of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis, told Glenn Frankel of the Washington Post in the summer of 2006, quote, look, Israel didn't mobilize anybody over Iraq, and associating Israel with the neocons on this issue is preposterous. Israel didn't see Iraq as a danger, and what's more, it had no interest in pushing the Bush administration's democracy agenda, unquote. This view...
I was going to say, as we've laid out here, there's an element of truth in that it wasn't necessarily just Israel per se in a general contextualizing of Israel. And there's some truth to that, but this also, if this is indeed the case and you believe this, and then you still, like, this is why it's so vitally important for us to be honest about the nature of this very super powerful lobby that has so much influence over our foreign policy, particularly as it relates to our Congress and to our elected officials in particular, and also about this you used the term earlier of people that are professing to act in the interest of of Israel, that are pushing for these hardline policies. They need to be honest about both of these aspects and try to distinguish what is and is not Israel per se with relation to that. Because on one hand, you can say that I think it is deeper than just simply saying this is for Israel per se, or Israel push this or that. But you got to take into consideration that there is a very powerful lobby that acts in the name of Israel that has so much influence and power over our elected officials, combined with this nest of hawks that profess to act in the interest of Israel. So that all needs to be dealt with, and it's very difficult to have these types of discussions within our society because of a combination of sensitivities around aspects as it relates to the Jewish aspect of this, combined with people who just don't want to have this conversation for purposes of like not wanting to keep lid on things. So.
Yeah, in a certain way, I would actually call it a transnational sort of terrorist policy cell combined with a counterintelligence threat network long term, basically. And those two phrases, I think, help understand the nature of what's even behind potentially what's then called the Israel lobby, or elements that worked in relationship inside of the Israel lobby. So, all right. Let's see, where were we here? Okay, page 261 of the Israel lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, "This view undoubtedly reflects Feldman's beliefs about Israel's interests and the hierarchy of threats it faced. But as we have shown, it is contrary to what Israel's leaders were actually saying and doing in the run-up to the war. Not to be outdone, Martin Kramer, a research fellow at WINEP, claims that any attempt to link Israel and the lobby with the war in Iraq is, quote, simply a falsehood, unquote, arguing that, quote, in the year preceding the Iraq War, Israel time and again disagreed with the United States, arguing that Iran posed the greater threat, unquote. But as shown above, Israel's concerns about Iran never led it to undertake a significant effort to halt the march to war. To the contrary, top Israeli officials were doing everything in their power to make sure that the United States went after Saddam and did not get cold feet at the last moment. They considered Iraq a serious threat and were convinced that Bush would deal with Iran after he finished with Iraq. They might have preferred that America focus on Iran before Iraq, but as Kramer admits, Israelis, quote, shed no tears over Saddam's demise, unquote.
And as we've identified, somebody like a Michael Ledeen, like, even during the lead up to the war in Iraq, he's out there actively saying like Iran is the prize and we need to go after Iran. And I'd even indicate, even looking at people like John Bolton in this particular element within the Bush administration, and once again seeming to be rather close to Cheney, that we're pushing for like some type of effort to actually get the United States into a military conflict with Iran. Yes, even many of the Iraq hawks were pushing for like ultimately like this is the gateway for the big prize, which is Iran, so that is also a reality. So,
okay, bottom of page 261 of the Israel lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. Okay. Quote, instead, their leaders took to the American airwaves, wrote op-eds, testified before Congress, and worked closely with the neoconservatives in the Pentagon and the Vice President's office to shape the intelligence about Iraq and coordinate the drive to war. Yossi Alfer, an Israeli strategist at the Jaffe Center, now maintains that former Prime Minister Sharon had serious reservations about invading Iraq, and he privately warned Bush against it. Alfer even hints that Sharon might have been able to prevent the war had he spoken out about his concerns. He writes, quote, had Sharon made his criticism public, citing the dangers posed to vital Israeli interests, might he have made a difference in the pre-war debate in the United States and the world, unquote? This is a convenient alibi now that the occupation of Iraq has gone south, but there is no evidence in the public record that Sharon ever advised Bush not to attack Iraq. In fact, there is considerable evidence that the Israeli leader and his key advisors strongly endorsed the war and encouraged Bush to begin it sooner rather than later. If Sharon believed the war to be a mistake, why did his own spokesman repeatedly stress the danger of Iraq's WMD? And why did Sharon himself warn the Bush administration that putting off the attack, quote, will not create a more convenient environment for action in the future, unquote. It is possible that Sharon made different arguments behind closed doors than he made in public. This is not likely, however, as word of Sharon's opposition to the war would surely have leaked out before it began, if not in the first year or two after Baghdad fell. Sharon was rarely reticent about expressing his views, even when doing so involved disagreements with the United States, and it is hard to believe that he would have kept silent in public if he thought that the decision to invade Iraq would be harmful to Israel. In short, neither facts nor logic support Alfer's claim. Quote, victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan, unquote. As the various progenitors of the Iraq disaster now seek to deny their paternity, President John F. Kennedy's rueful remark is more appropriate than ever. But Iraq did not always look like the blunder it has turned out to be. For a few short months in the spring of 2003, the United States appeared to have won a stunning victory, and there was little need for Israel's defenders to deny responsibility for the war. During this brief window of opportunity, in fact, key Israelis and their American allies began to pressure the Bush administration to bring U.S. power to bear on Syria and Iran, in the hope that these two rogue states would suffer the same fate as Saddam Hussein's regime. Let us now consider how Israel and the lobby influenced U.S. policy on Syria and then turn to Iran. Unquote. That's the end of the chapter 8 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. Chapter 8 titled Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East. So there's, some interesting additional lines of analysis that they then leave hanging there from their own perspective and then move into it. And like I pointed out before we began reading this chapter last in our part 1, that the chapter before it actually has to do with the Israel lobby and the Palestinians. So there's a lot of interesting context here that would provide more information about this. But we'll have to wait till part 3 of this, where we'll begin to then fill in some of the other gaps here around actually reading the text of the clean break paper that was referred to, and then getting into this background, this deeper background of what they began to refer to in terms of some of which interests were involved in Iraq and the politics of oil, as we will read from Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. On our next part 3 of this Iraq War 18th anniversary deep dive into its origins for the Antidote and the Antidote Deep Core Text Club on Clubhouse. But thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you very much, Greg, for the deep dive. And until next week. Or next time, who knows when this will
part
be?
Part 3 pretty soon. We'll be back soon. We'll get to part 3 soon here. And we're also working to follow up on the first part of what we put out regarding China and the book Seeds of Fire. We'll be following up on that as well here. And no exact date, but it will be pretty soon.
Yep. All right. Very good. All right.
And thank you, Jeremy.
All right. Always. Thank you. All right. Goodbye.